Victory or death for Doomhammer!
Out what happened and making sure she really was on a path to recovery here. Instead, the medical team literally ran out of her room back out to the front of the ER because by this point, the Sunshine Hospital ER was overflowing with patients. There were all these people in the waiting room and also outside, and basically everybody had the same symptoms as Jody. They couldn't breathe. There were people slumped on the ground against the wall, screaming for help. I mean, the medical team was totally overwhelmed. And on top of that, there were ambulances literally lined up around the block waiting to drop off patients. There just wasn't any more space. But nonetheless, doctors and nurses and the medical team at the hospital worked furiously, moving from one patient to the next, sometimes in an exam room, sometimes out in the waiting room, sometimes outside. It's wherever the patients were. But the weird thing is all these people, they had the same symptoms, these severe asthma attacks, yet many of the people that were showing up had never had asthma in their lives before. So how was this happening? This went on for hours and hours. And really the situation in the hospital only continued to get worse, with more and more and more patients showing up with worse and worse symptoms. And so during this madness, Jody, who really hadn't gotten better, she just stabilized. She actually was moved out of the emergency room and over to the ICU, pretty much just to create one more space for new patients. And so in the ICU, Jody's fiance sat next to her, gripping her hand, listening to the sound of the monitors beeping steadily all around her. Outside the room, he could see doctors and nurses and medical staff sprinting up and down the hallways, looking frantic and worried. He had no idea what was happening. He just hoped Jody would be okay. But it would turn out there actually was someone who knew exactly what was going on. A university researcher named Philip Taylor had actually predicted this the day before. Professor Taylor was an expert in atmospheric allergens, a field so niche that barely anybody outside of his small research circle had even heard of it. And so on the afternoon of November 20th, the day before, Taylor had been at home in his office analyzing data when he noticed something very alarming. All of the ingredients for a catastrophic event were aligning in the forecast, and the patterns were so precise that it stopped him cold. Taylor was stunned. He'd spent years studying the effects of weather on public health, but he'd never seen anything like this before. And at the same time, Taylor also realized that as alarming as this was, very few other people, if anybody, would see this as a problem. He was like the one person in the world that had the expertise to see how catastrophic this might actually be. And so desperate to warn others, he wound up posting a very urgent announcement on this weather website that he managed. But unfortunately, it just wasn't seen by enough people in time. And so now, as hospitals all across Melbourne overflowed with people gasping for air, Taylor sat in his backyard watching the storm unfold. The sky was pitch black, rain and hail was coming down, the wind was whipping, and off in the distance, all he could hear was thunder and sirens. And he knew, unfortunately, his prediction had been right. Just like Professor Taylor's weather models had predicted, on November 21st, 2016, Melbourne, Australia was hit by an extremely rare event known as thunderstorm asthma. This deadly phenomenon can only occur when three very specific weather conditions align. 1, high heat during the day. 2, a very powerful thunderstorm. And 3, extremely high pollen levels. Melbourne's heat that day had caused unusually high concentrations of ryegrass pollen to hang in the air. And then when that huge thunderstorm rolled in, the intense humidity, the wind, and the rain shattered the pollen grains into microscopic fragments. And then these tiny particles, which were way smaller than regular pollen, were carried by this storm deep into people's homes and into their lungs. Unlike normal pollen, these microscopic fragments bypassed the body's typical defenses and embedded themselves deep into people's lungs, causing severe and sudden asthma attacks. Now, for people who already had asthma, This was catastrophic, but even perfectly healthy people found themselves gasping for air, overwhelmed by the sheer density of this microscopic pollen. The storm had essentially made the air everybody in Melbourne was breathing deadly. As for Jody Santoro, she would spend days in the ICU, hooked up to monitors, with machines pumping oxygen into her lungs, while her body fought to heal. But she was lucky. She would eventually recover, and in the days that followed, she would learn the full scale of what actually happened in Melbourne. Nearly 10,000 people had flooded the hospitals across Australia, complaining of the same symptoms that Jody did. And unfortunately, of those 10,000, 10 people actually lost their lives. Many of them were totally healthy and had never had an asthma attack in their lives before. For Jody, despite surviving this ordeal, the awful memory of what happened on that night will forever be in her mind. She is now all too aware of how fragile life can be and how quickly things can change. I'm going to play you a clip from my other podcast, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. After you're done listening to it, be sure to check out Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries on any podcast platform. Give it a follow. New episodes every Tuesday. Enjoy.
Early in July of 1982, a corrections officer made his rounds at a jail in San Jose, California. Everything seemed normal as he inspected each inmate's cell. But as the guard peered into the last cell on the row, he was startled by what he saw. The inmate was sitting on his bunk, staring forward, his mouth hanging open. He looked completely frozen, almost like something out of a wax museum. The guard gave the cell door a few loud knocks with his flashlight, but the inmate didn't move or even blink. The guard was afraid that the inmate was dead. So he unlocked the door and stepped into the cell, and he got right up next to the inmate, and when he did, he could feel breath coming from the man's open mouth. So he knew he was alive. He gently touched the inmate to try to get him to react, but he didn't, and that gentle tap made the man's whole body rock back and forth on the bunk like a rocking chair. The guy was stiff as a board. The guard had no idea what was going on, and he was feeling very freaked out. But then he noticed the inmate's eyes. They had a look of absolute terror in them. The guard knew this man needed help right now.
Today, I'm going to share 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I will share the photo that is famously associated with that story.
But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please replace all of the like button's toilet paper with duct tape. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 1 p.m. on November 2nd, 2020, an older man named Marcel Terray stood in his backyard hanging damp clothes on a clothesline. Marcel and his wife, 83-year-old Paulette Landru, lived on a quiet street in the small city of Anden, Belgium. And usually, their days were filled with household chores or visits from their kids. But over the last few months, Marcel had started to spend a lot more time taking care of his wife because she had recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia that causes memory loss and confusion. And so Paulette needed help remembering to eat or to take her medications on time. And sometimes she would just wander off without telling Marcel, and Marcel would have to go corral her and bring her back home. For Marcel, watching his wife struggle with this disease was absolutely heartbreaking, and so he did everything in his power to make her life as comfortable and happy as he possibly could. And so before he had come out to hang up the laundry, he had made sure to set his wife up in front of her TV with a nice lunch so she could eat and watch her favorite show. And so Marcel hung up the last piece of clothing and then picked up the empty laundry basket and headed back towards the house. When he went inside, he expected to see his wife still sitting on the couch watching TV, but she wasn't there anymore. Marcel immediately began calling out his wife's name, but she didn't call back. And then he searched the whole house and he couldn't find her. And so starting to panic, he went outside, he searched the outside of the house, she wasn't there. He even knocked on some neighbors' doors, but they hadn't seen her. And so at this point, Marcel was very scared, given the fact that his wife had Alzheimer's and could easily wander off and put herself in a very dangerous situation without even knowing. And so instead of waiting any longer to just hope she showed up again, he picked up the phone and he called the police. Less than an hour later, Marcel stood outside of his house looking at helicopters flying overhead, and he knew at least half a dozen officers were spread out around the neighborhood, knocking on neighbors' doors. There were canine units searching the surrounding area. This huge search, it was all for Paulette. Marcel was glad to see that clearly the police had taken the search very seriously, and so he was confident that they would find his wife and that hopefully she'd be okay. But the hours kept ticking by, and as the sun began to go down, there still was no sign of Paulette. A police officer told Marcel that they would keep on investigating and hopefully find his wife as soon as possible. But over the next few days and weeks, Paulette didn't turn up, nobody had any idea where she was, and before long, weeks turned into months, and then months turned into 2 full years that nobody had seen Paulette. And by that point, Marcel had basically resigned himself to the fact that he very likely would die without ever figuring out what happened to his wife. But then, one day in early October of 2022, so 2 years after Paulette went missing, one of Marcel and Paulette's neighbors was at home on their computer looking at a particular website. And as they were scrolling through this website, they happened upon an image that as soon as they saw it, they froze. Because this neighbor was very well aware of the fact that Paulette had gone missing and nobody had found her. But now they're seeing this image on this website that basically gives away what happened to her. And so totally shocked that they had even found this image, the neighbor screenshotted it and brought it to the police. So it would turn out that neighbor was looking at Google Street View, which is a feature of Google Maps that basically allows you to see 360-degree views of basically anywhere on the planet. To create these images, Google literally sends out these special vehicles all over the world that have cameras that sit on top of the cars. And these cars drive down basically all the streets all over the place, constantly taking pictures all around them. It just so happened on the exact day that Paulette went missing in 2020, there happened to be a Google car driving down the road that captured a picture of her. And so as you can see in the picture of her, you see Paulette on the left side of the image walking across the street away from her home, which is on the right side. And on the right side, you can actually see Marcel in the backyard hanging up laundry on the clothesline. And so the police, after getting this image, they basically followed the projected route Paulette was on, which is basically beelining straight across the road, and they found that across the street was this steep hill that led down to this thick bramble bush. And inside of that bramble bush was Paulette, and she was deceased. And so very likely, Paulette, in her confused state, walked straight across the street, as we see in the image, and then fell down that hill and got trapped at the bottom inside of that bramble bush and couldn't move. And so when that huge search for her was going on, very likely she was just trapped down there but didn't understand what was going on, couldn't necessarily yell up to communicate with anybody, and so she stayed down there and died. And unfortunately, it would take 2 more full years and a random image on Google Street View before Marcel could finally get the closure he needed.
Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. I've talked a lot about how therapy really helped me when I left the military in 2017. It took time, but I went from being this very angry person who was struggling with depression to feeling like I was at peace and content again. And today, part of the reason I still consider myself to be very well adjusted is because of the skills I have learned in therapy. The most important skill that I find myself leaning on most days is self-awareness, something I definitely lacked pre-therapy. Now I'm very in tune with how I feel and how it affects me personally, but also how it affects the people around me. Like my mood and behavior can have an enormous effect on my friends and family, and I need to be aware of that. And so that self-awareness kind of keeps me from spiraling when I start to struggle. So while therapy is certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution, I do think it's a great starting point for anybody who's struggling. And while therapy can be costly, there are affordable options, such as online therapy platforms like BetterHelp. BetterHelp is on a mission to make starting therapy easier. All you have to do is fill out a quick questionnaire, and then you'll be paired up with a licensed BetterHelp therapist within a couple of days.
One of the best features of BetterHelp is that if the first therapist does not feel like the right fit, you can continue to switch therapists until you find someone you really connect with, and it's at no additional cost. So really, BetterHelp is trying to find the right person for you. So if you're struggling right now and you think you might benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin for 10% off your first month of therapy. Okay, back to the story. Around 10 a.m. on July 26, 2015, 31-year-old mom named Xiang Lu Xuan and her husband chased their 2-year-old son around a brand new indoor playground. This playground was on the 6th floor of a mall in Jingzhou City, which is in central China. And so Xiang and her husband had come to this mall today just so their son could basically enjoy this playground. And currently, he was running around in circles and laughing hysterically. He thought it was great. Xiang caught up to her son and scooped him up and then placed him at the top of a slide. And he happily slid down to the bottom, and when he reached the bottom, Xiang was waiting for him, and the son, he just stopped and looked past her and pointed and started saying, "Ride, ride." And so Xiang, she turned around and she saw right behind them were these 2 escalators, one going up and one going down. And so Xiang realized her son clearly thought these escalators were maybe a part of this playground, and so he wanted to go use them. They were a fun attraction. And so Xiang smiled and took her son's hand and then told her husband they're gonna go ride the ride, the escalators, and then they began walking over. Once Xiang and her son actually reached the escalator, suddenly her son was not as keen to hop on board. He was nervous. But Xiang, who had ridden escalators many times before, told her son it's totally safe, and she kind of coaxed him to do it, and eventually he stepped on right alongside her, holding her hand, and about halfway up the escalator, when she was confident her son would be okay, Xiang turned around and looked up towards the top of the escalator, the 7th floor where they were going. And she saw 3 mall employees at the top of the escalator on the 7th floor where they were going. And they were clearly looking at Xiang with a very serious look on their faces, and they were gesturing at something towards the top of the escalator. It seemed like they could be warning her about something or simply pointing something out. She wasn't really sure. And so she looked up at them like, what's going on here? But the 3 mall employees just didn't do a good job communicating whatever was going on or whatever issue they were dealing with. And so as a result, Xiang and her son just continued riding up the escalator. And as they got closer and closer, these mall employees continued to gesture at something happening on the 7th floor just beyond the escalator, and Xiang still totally confused. And then finally, when Xiang and her son reached the top and stepped off, Xiang suddenly understood what these employees were referencing, but by now, it was too late. Moments